Welcome to Childfree Rallies. Today is the first Childfree Rally and it's April 2021. And our guest today is Dr. Kimya Dennis from 365 Diversity. Welcome to Childfree Rallies, Kimya.
Thank you. It is so wonderful to see you. And I adore and love what you all are doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. It's always a pleasure to talk to you too. So today's topic is going to be how child-free by choice is shaped by underserved and minoritized identities and experiences, and also shaped by overrepresented and power majority identities and experiences. But before we get started, I would really like to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself because nobody better to do it than yourself. So everyone
Oh,
here who's watching can know where you're coming from and all your experience.
thank you. So I am an activist, a sociologist and criminologist, educator and researcher, and I specialize in reproductive rights, sexual rights and freedoms. I also specialize in mental health, suicide and suicidal self-harm. And I particularly focus on underserved, minoritized, and marginalized groups. And the work I do is based on centuries of activism and centuries of writings. So if you come to me talking about a New York Times bestseller, I don't care. Uh, if you don't know what's been going on for centuries, this real work, then you are not really invested in equity and justice. You're invested in catchwords and catchy phrases. That's not real work. So that's what I do, including I conducted the first known study with child-free, permanently child-free by choice people of African descent around the world in 2013. And I created the first known college course about child-free by choice. And some of my students already had children, and they said they wish they had taken a course before they had children. They love their children, but they wish they had known about options. This is what I do unapologetically everywhere that I exist. So thank you so much.
And yeah, it is important, the awareness of what you just mentioned about having awareness of that it is a choice. And
Mhm.
the only thing I want to add to everything that you said is that you're a very well respected person in the Childfree community as well.
Oh,
Um,
that's hard to know because child free community is very white.
it,
And I've had child free white women in particular uh, come at me talking about why do you keep bringing up race?
oh,
And so these are not my wonderful child-free white women who have been my mentors in doing this work, but these have been the people who follow them on social media and these child-free groups that are basically white people around the world who, they'll address like gender and sexuality, but the moment you make it about race and ethnicity, that's when it's a problem. So that's centuries of white people thinking that they are the creators and in charge of it, and that they're the race neutral objective experts. And they're not accustomed to being challenged either.
that's true. But you are very well respected. So let's dive right in the topic because I am so curious to know. There's just so much about it that I've been learning as well very recently, and
Mhm.
who better to talk about this than you with your experience?
Thank you so much.
Right.
So,
So how is the child free by choice shaped by majorities and minorities?
all right. So first we want to make sure people understand when we say majorities, we're talking about power dynamics, right? So as it pertains to race, white people are the power majority. And white people are the power majority, even when white people are the population size minority. So you can look at this when you look at, for example, the continent of Africa, when you look at this in terms of South America and the Caribbean, even when white people are not represented in the population as much, white people tend to still be the power majority in terms of decision making. And I want to clarify this because it's very common for people of African descent to deny that white people are the power majority. People will say things like, well, I never have to see white people. And I says, well, you can if you go to your library, if you go to the materials used in your school, if you go to the police practices, it's oftentimes developed by European white people. So that's important because when we're talking about the importance of addressing majority and minority, we don't want people to think it's only based on population size. And we also want people to understand that this is not about bias. I'm very opposed to bias trainings because those are disguises to hide what's really happening, which is power that controls what gynecologists do. So we oftentimes will talk about this in child-free networks. Will say, my gynecologist denied me this tubal ligation, but someone's husband was given a vasectomy without much question. So people will understand it when we talk about the gender divide. But it's when we talk about race and ethnicity and the fact that most biological females, most girls and women, even if the gynecologist is of their same ethnicity, culture, religion, and race, the gynecologist tends to not be taught holistic health, but it's very much taught European white health. And so that's why I specialize in community health equity, because literally almost every academic program, almost every career training, almost every book you read is really much based on European white standards of reproduction, European white standards of the purpose of females existing. And so therefore, when females, girls, and women go to gynecologists to talk about their decision never to have children, and especially when we're talking about heterosexual in terms of reducing the likelihood of pregnancy, it's very common for doctors to say, well, you don't really know what you want, do you? You might change your mind. And that's even more prevalent when we're talking about racial and ethnic groups such as Indigenous, African, Black, Asian, non-white, Hispanic, non-white, Latinx, Latin A, Latino, who oftentimes are especially told that there's no such thing as reproductive freedom. So a lot of times when people talk about reproductive freedom, they really are talking about white women of various ethnicities, cultures, and religions around the world. And child-free communities is very difficult to have this discussion because I remember when the child-free scholars who were white women started advertising my research in 2013, it was the child-free white women who were outraged. Like, how dare you make this about race? You are dividing us. I mean, the child-free community is the same white dominance as elsewhere. White people think that these topics of race do not exist until white people feel like talking about it. So that's an example of how majority and minority come into it. And this is white people who are the nicest white people in the world, but that's 529 years of white people thinking that they can smile and then we won't call it out. I tell people white terrorism does not reduce based on white people smiling at you. And the same thing applies when we're talking about reproductive rights and the decision to never have children.
That is
I
something.
know I just said a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot there that that I would like us to like go a little bit deeper.
Mhm.
The first thing is talking about the child-free space. It is quite white dominated, and I feel that that is the same way in like different other communities online. And you know, there's a lot of Black people who are also voicing their choice to not have children. What would you say to these people who are just coming into this space? What would you think? What would you tell them that you think it's important for them to know in the child free space?
So, what I tell African Black people who are deciding to never have children and are still figuring out whether that's what they want is to start specifically looking on internet search engines for other African Black people around the world who have made the decision. Oftentimes, the first things that will pop up is my work. I intentionally do public writings because I don't believe in exclusive scholarship. I want it to be something that's accessible to everyone around the world. So I tell people, introduce yourself. And so oftentimes people will send me an email to introduce themselves, and then we'll have conversations about reproductive rights. That includes forms of sexuality, gender identity, and everything that goes into the culture. So I tell people, start researching this, see if there are local organizations that can help, see if there might be some medical professionals who can help with this. And if not, this is where there have been child-free networks where people have created a wonderful list of gynecologists where they live so everyone can access that information. So I used to always refer people to my gynecologist because my gynecologist would do tubal ligations without challenging you. It was, he would tell you, it's not my job to pretend to know your rights and your what you want more than you know. So that's one thing that I always tell people is start researching this. I used to tell people years ago to read some books about it, but to be honest with you, reading books is wonderful if you're going to do a book club gathering. But in terms of practical application, I just tell people to start actually meeting more people and interacting with more people. And when I started doing the child-free research with people of African descent in different nations around the world, it was the same patterns over and over again. Most people did not have anyone to speak with in their family about this, and also religion tied into this. So some people actually became atheists throughout the process of deciding to never have children. And then also mental illness ties into this as well. So some people do not want to pass down generations of mental illness to children. So whenever people say child-free people are selfish, I always say, first of all, we don't have to explain our choices to you, but if we so choose to waste our time doing so, humans have been selfish for tens of thousands of years, but most humans have had children. So having children is not a selfless thing, especially when it's done by choice and not by force. And child-free people who do not want to pass down mental illness or physical illness are actually being very considerate. Because there are a lot of people in the world who will tell you, if they're in a free space to exchange ideas, that they wish they were never born, which is also tied to suicidal behavior as well.
Yeah, that is something that I have also noticed. Um, Now I'm wondering, what would you say is the main difference that you have seen, you have noticed between child-free people of color and child-free people, white child-free people, basically, in terms of making their decision? Because I know that culturally speaking, there's just this big difference.
Yeah. So child-free white people also have traditional conservative viewpoints forced on them, oftentimes very religious, and that's around the world. Very religious beliefs that especially females only exist for reproduction purposes. And so very traditional conservative views regarding religion and gender identity and sexuality are very common among white child-free groups. The difference is that since white people control nearly everything in parts of the world, that white people have more options. Most white people are taught eventually that you do have these freedoms to make these choices. They're more likely to find just a random doctor on an internet search engine, and the doctor is more likely to be white or white accommodating. So white accommodating is a medical doctor who might be of Asian diaspora, African diaspora, and taught and trained based on a white health model that does not require having conversations about issues such as race. And so that's a huge difference with white child-free people as compared to child-free people who are of various ethnicities and cultures put within the Black and Brown categories. People who are put within Black and Brown categories, we're talking about tens of thousands of years, billions of people, billions of cultures and identities and religions tend to still be lumped into the category of you have to reproduce, and oftentimes are in societies where they're just told that it's going to happen. If you say you don't want it, it's still going to happen because why else would you exist? And so that's a huge difference when you're in child-free environments. I did a YouTube video a couple of years ago now after having this back and forth with child-free white women because they just insisted that race has nothing to do with this. And they did what white people tend to do, which is when Black and Brown people talk about race, white people try to switch it and say, you're racist, right? They'll say, you're racist against white people, reverse racism, all that routine. And so that's what I just had to be honest and say, these child-free networks are the exact same white terrorism as everywhere else. You know, child free white people scream about wanting rights and freedoms and choices, except when it's talking about things like racial justice. And that's why I always tell people that if you are a white child free person, you need to challenge the white dominance within child free networks, which is what some white child free experts have been doing. They've been good at doing those challenges, but even that has been based on convenience. It's been based on making sure you don't ruffle too many feathers, making sure you don't lose friends. And I tell white people, it's just like any other power majority. If you're going based on making sure you keep other white people happy and friendly to you, then you're not really doing this to help us. You're doing this so that you cannot be criticized for not doing anything. So it's the same routine over and over again.
We definitely need more diverse voices in our community to, speak up and talk about these subjects, because I feel that there's just not a lot of information. I mean, there is, but there isn't a lot of focus on this information out there. And I feel that it's so important. I'm speaking of minorities, but um, more towards like LGBTQ community and um, other type of, um, yes, like not based specifically on race or ethnicity. What are your thoughts there regarding, how they can influence or not the child-free choice?
Yeah, so wonderfully, there's a larger, increasing representation for LGBTQIA people who are child free. It's still dominated by cisgender heterosexuals, unfortunately, but there's increased voices because I remember when I first started doing presentations at professional conferences, my research was very cisgender heterosexual. And thankfully, some Black women who attended were themselves in married to women and to Black women in particular, and they explained that pronatalism is not only heterosexuals. So they also wanted to challenge that. So I really appreciate that because myself as a cisgender heterosexual woman, and I am also a strong advocate and collaborator with people who are LGBTQIA, and particularly African Black people. I always say these challenges to me are important for me to do for myself because we have to dismantle the normalcy of cisgender and heterosexual. We're talking about dismantling pronatalism. We're talking about dismantling reproductive injustices and disparities, sexuality injustices and disparities. It cannot be done within this narrow scope of cisgender and heterosexual. So thankfully, LGBTQIA voices are increasing in terms of the child-free community, but we have to remember, including in that, LGBTQIA voices are still controlled by white people. Nearly every mainstream LGBTQIA organization in every city in the United States of America in particular that gets all the funding, gets all the support, it's white people. I always tell people, you got to remember, why do Black and Brown people create LGBTQIA spaces? Because they tried to join these white dominated LGBTQIA spaces and were reminded daily that this LGBTQIA space is going to pretend that there's no such thing as racial division, which is not true, right? Despite the origins of pride parades, despite the origins of all of this, which were African Black people, Black and Brown people, right? These LGBTQIA organizations are mostly white people. And so that also translates to child free. So it creates a safe space, another safe space mostly for white people. So that's why it's always clarified. If we're talking about LGBTQIA child free, we're talking about child free people with disabilities. When we're talking about all these different scopes within child free, we got to make sure we highlight whose voices are still the loudest and who are still considered the spokespersons and the experts. It's still oftentimes white people. And when you try to challenge that, you're told that you're being unappreciative, you're being racist against white people, as if white people don't already have plenty of spaces to be vocal.
Yeah, that's something that I have noticed as well. That reminds me of something that I heard very recently, and it is the rise of voices within the Black and Brown community, it's mostly men, cis heterosexual men, who are completely against this idea of women, Black and Brown women, being able to make choices of their own, on their own bodies, and they're very prenatalist, and they're trying to sort of uh, I don't know if the word would be control, but I was wondering if you've heard about this and what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, difficulty, which goes into the whole interlocking effects, and these are centuries of issues. So when you're looking at pro-Black and pro-Brown entities and organizations, a lot of them tend to be very dominated by men. And so that's where the problem becomes masculinity, patriarchy, and men being presented as the objective and neutral experts. And oftentimes you'll hear people say men are the unemotional ones. So we should believe them because they're not crying while they're presenting their expertise. And that's a huge part of the debate because in African brown cultures around the world, there are people who falsely believe that it was European whites who introduced patriarchy, which is not true. When we're talking about tens of thousands of years in the African continent, there were always some cultures that were patriarchal male men dominant. And that manifests when you join some pro Black organizations that are very male men dominant over and over again. So over the years, I've joined some pro Black community groups where I show up, and despite my background as an activist born and raised in Richmond, which is Second Capital Confederacy, despite my expertise, I show up and I'm expected to defer to the men. And essentially, we're turned into the administrative assistants. And I'm non compliant. I don't comply with any form of power majority, whether it's white people, whether it's men, any of that. And so, of course, the response to my non compliance is that I don't understand the larger purpose. Or people will say, oh, you're one of those feminists, which means, you've conformed to white people. And then I tell people, if you think that gender justice was created by white women during women's suffrage and white women's version of feminism, that you don't understand the origins of some of our African cultures for thousands of years. So that's the complexity because we're talking about school systems, K through 12, colleges, including doctoral programs around the world that are mostly controlled by white people. So most Black and brown people around the world only know white people's version of everything, right? And if they're teachers, they're teaching that to every generation. And so this is why I have to tell people, what knowledge are you developing? Whose version of it? Like, is it white version of history? Is it white version of sciences, white version of mathematics, white versions of arts? And are you incorporating white version of everything into your organizations and pretending that your organization is now a reproductive rights organization or a pro-Black organization or pro-Asian organization? It can't be pro-underserved people if it's mostly based on white people, if it's mostly based on men. Like, that cannot be your foundation. Like, I see that a lot when I see African Black people quoting Marx and they're proud Marxists. I tell them, you're not dismantling the establishment if all you know is Marx and don't know the foundation that came before Marx. And you don't know people like Claudia Jones, Dr. W.B. Du Bois, Dr. Oliver Cromwell Cox, Ida B. Wells, like the indigenous, natives, and Africans who did this work, but you're quoting Marx. You have to always challenge the foundation of people's activism. Because if their foundation is based on the oppressor, then they're not being activists. They're being tokens and nothing more.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there as well. There's just this is a complex subject, and I love talking about this with you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I mean, not but I just want to say that there's just so much to take into account. And like speaking of gender specifically, um, I've been, we've been doing this for, I haven't been in the child free space for a long time, but I have noticed that most of the voices that are in the space, that are heard in the space, are women. There aren't a lot of men who are, they can say they're like child free influencers or that have, loud voices in our space. And I was wondering if that is a good thing or if we should have more men speaking in our space as well. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I definitely think there should be all genders represented, which is not just two genders, but gender non-identifying people and transgender as well. When I conducted the child-free research, I was primarily focusing on women, which include transgender women, but I did include three men in the study. And the part of it that was interesting and unfortunate is that there was really only one of the African diaspora men who really was child free, and he still is. The other African men, including on the Western Hemisphere, were they wanted to not have children. However, throughout the interview, they eventually said, however, if she gets pregnant, that's life happens. And I explained to the men who I interviewed that child free for heterosexuals, if you're talking about opposite sex, opposite gender attractions, and all that stuff, yes, accidental pregnancies can happen. A lot of people don't like the word accidental because they're like, if you're having sex, it's not accidental. But we're talking about in terms of people who, the carelessness of thousands of years of humans, right? Yes, that can happen. But if you truly are declaring yourself child free by choice, the idea is that you want to reduce the likelihood of that happening. And some of the men in particular were like, well, it's based on what she wants, which contrasts what child-free women tend to say. Child-free women tend to say, I'm not going to go into this trusting the man. I'm going to go into it preparing for my own choices and what I do not want. Whereas men tend to say, I'm just going to show up and whatever happens, happens. And that's based in tens of thousands of years of pronatalist cultures that when they teach, well, first of all, most cultures don't teach about sexuality. Like sex education courses are horrendous. And so, especially boys and men are oftentimes taught that you just show up, maybe you'll bring a condom, if not, whatever, and you just do it. And so now when I present in communities about sex and safe sex, oftentimes it's the men who are offended because they've been taught all their life that they can walk around with their penis in their hand and they're in control of doing whatever they want. And it's the woman's job or the girl's job, even, to just figure out the rest. So when we talk about bringing in more men as voices, it has to be based within the context of dismantling patriarchy, male men dominance, and dismantling the idea that men, when they show up, that they're not the ones who have to worry about birth control and pregnancy prevention. Because even if we don't have a reliable birth control for men, we need men in child-free spaces who are not just going around humping raw dog and then being like, whoops, she got pregnant, life happens. They can't be the voice for child-free spaces because that actually solidifies the bingos that we're told, right? Like, whoops, you might get pregnant by accident.
Yeah.
So I don't want men in these child-free spaces who are going to solidify that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I completely agree with you. And you know, I one of the things that angers me and gets me really riled up is the fact that there aren't a lot of options for birth control for men. It's either a condom or vasectomy. Because pharmaceuticals are like, oh no, side effects are horrible, but women, they can endure anything. Like, whatever, let's let them like go through all the side effects of having to take birth control. Or and at the same time, we're the ones being denied voluntary sterilization, whereas because we don't know any better, right? We are mature enough we're to have a child, but we're not mature enough to make a decision of, getting a voluntary sterilization surgery. So it's I mean, it's rigged. The whole thing is and so for me, like I said, it gets me really riled up because it's true. And the one thing that also bothers me, specifically in the Latino culture, and speaking from experience, is how that kind of behavior in men is actually facilitated by their own mothers. And then their mothers are saying, "Oh, but this world is such a man's world." But yes, but you're the one who is actually, you know, teaching your sons to behave like this. So how do we break that cycle? That's always a big question, and I would like to know what you think about that.
Yeah, so as you know, there's been an increase in non-white Hispanics and non-white Latinx, Latinas, and Latinos in child-free communities. There's been a few more writings over the years regarding that, but even that is still difficult to find because it's very traditional conservative religion, including Catholicism, right? Which I have many critiques of religions, including Catholicism, and I have a problem with females, girls, and women needing to care about what a pope says about birth control. I have a problem with that. And when I talk about having a problem with that, I don't care about how people view religion in terms of you got to be sensitive to religions. On the Western Hemisphere, Christianity is the power majority, and that includes Catholicism that is white dominated. So, white people, whether it's white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism and Catholicism in particular, are not being dismantled of power just because we have to be honest and say girls, women, and biological females should not give a damn about what the Pope said, what the Pope says. The Pope is not the expert on any topic, especially this one. And it's just horrible over the past 5 years. You all are familiar that first the Pope says birth control is horrible, then the Pope says, blah, blah, blah. And then people are like, yay, Eureka. Okay, I've changed my mind. Every time the Pope changes his mind, I'm changing my mind. That's horrific. But it illustrates tens of thousands of years of humans going based on cult following, ruining their lives and ruining each other's lives based on this idol that they have. And so, if we want to talk about changing reproductive justice, sexual justice, changing body autonomy, and all of that, it has to come with dismantling the power of religion in many cultures. And that's something that's centuries in the making because this has been going on for thousands of years. When we're talking about dismantling different power and also challenging how this shapes school systems and health facilities. So when you go to medical facilities, it's very much based in the religion of the employees, especially the decision makers. And it's even worse when you go to health facilities that admit that they are Christian based or Catholic owned. And when they say things like, we're Catholic owned and operated, but Catholicism does not shape policies and procedures, they're lying 100%. So if we're talking about reducing that, it requires challenging what people consider normal. And we have to admit that that perceived normalcy is 100% based on European white colonialism, 100% based on European white Christian missionaries, 100% based on these religions that were forced on us through stolen land, stolen people, raped, murdered, and controlled, which takes the form of police departments, of K through 12 in colleges, medical facilities, employers. It's in every single aspect of our lives on the Western Hemisphere and around the world. So to change that, you have to be willing to call it out exactly where it is, challenge what people tell you is normal, challenge aspects of policies and laws. And you also have to know that you're going to make your family angry. So, like if you have a very traditional conservative family, you got to let them know I love you, but I can really love you from a distance. And that literally requires challenging everything. Nothing changes through compliance. So I tell people, if you want to invite me to this space, like over the years, I've had churches invite me to do mental health trainings about Black mental health and Black suicide. If you're inviting me to this space, you have to realize I do not defer to religion. Like, I'm not going to talk about Black suicide and then you end it with, well, we'll just pray it away and you think I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to challenge every aspect of everything because I refuse to allow people to risk their lives for these religious people. So the same thing pertains to when we're talking about child free. But if people are unwilling to lose friends, family, to lose their connections with religious people, to possibly lose a job because their job is controlled by religious people, nothing's going to change. Religious people are the power majority for a reason, because it's the same cycle of there not being many options. People comply. There are atheists and agnostics, Muslims, people of various voodoo religions and faiths and spiritualities who work for these Christians all up and down the Western Hemisphere. They're being tortured through policies, procedures. These places will say they'll cover medical insurance unless birth control, abortion, that. And people are complying with that because they feel like they don't have options of places to work and places to go to school. So this is where community organizations need to come together and say, instead of people being forced to comply with these horrible procedures, we need to form some collectives and get some lawsuits going. Because when we talk about freedom of religion, we ain't talking about Christianity. Like, Christianity already is free of religion, you know what I'm saying? And we're not talking about white people's version either, because that's already the power majority. So it requires this honest dialogue, but also the next step, which is saying, how are we going to challenge this? Yes, we can include some marches. Yes, we can include some protests, but these places are never going to change if people don't boycott these places in the first place. Like, if they know you're going to come to work regardless tomorrow, why would they change? They have no reason to. If your family knows you're going to be at the next family reunion, regardless of what Papa said, then Papa's going to keep doing what he does. Same routine.
Yeah, it sounds, I mean, just in general, to dismantle religion, like it sounds like a massive undertaking, but it is true that if people don't individually challenge what we've been taught is the norm and what we need to comply to, then nothing's going to change ever.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that people have to not subscribe to religion. We come from tens of thousands of years of billions of people, hundreds of thousands of forms of religion, spiritualities, faith, non-religions, cults, and everything. So we're not saying to abandon religion. We're just talking about abandoning or getting rid of the power that religions have over people's lives. So, and I tell people, like, and I have people tell me this all the time when I talk about gender justice in particular and sexuality justice. People will say, well, I'm a Christian, therefore. And even though, like, Islam is very oftentimes traditional conservative, in the Western Hemisphere, it's most often Christians saying, well, I'm a Christian. And that's when I say, first of all, learn the origins of Christianity. That includes various forms of Christianity around the world, including forms of Christianity in cultures that have different identities for gender, different non-identities for gender, right? We have versions of Christianity in Cuba and other nations around the world, where it's nothing like the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant version that people take from the stolen knowledge in the King James Version. So I keep telling Christians, if you're going to come at me citing Christianity, I'm going to come at you for being brainwashed by white people and not learning the origins of Christianity and really still believing that Jesus had blue eyes, blonde hair, and spoke English because you watched the Ten Commandments as a child. Like, there are people who literally still learn that Jesus spoke English, that Jesus was 6 feet tall, that Jesus was going around judging people based on gender and sexuality. Tens of thousands of years of different forms of sexuality and genders, they really think that Jesus was cisgender, heterosexual, and bashing people's heads in if they weren't white and cisgender, heterosexual. And I tell people there's a reason why there are people who go to schools of theology and they learn some interesting stuff from their professors that leads them to leave Christianity and become agnostic and atheist. There are people who will tell you they went in as a staunch Christian and came back agnostic or atheist because they had good professors who actually told them, here's the reality of the historical Bible that you were never taught in the King James Version. So I tell people, I'm not getting rid of religions, but I'm getting rid of your ability to force that on the rest of us. But you can wear your Jesus t-shirt, you can wear your Allah t-shirt, you can, talk about the Torah, you can do everything you want to do. But the moment you want to force that on the rest of us and force us to comply with all of your beliefs, that's when there's a problem. And I also tell this to African Black people who are Black Hebrew Israelites, Five Percenters, Nation of Islam, all the different African faith bases as well. We're not getting rid of our thousands of years of faith bases on the continent of Africa and around the world. Instead, we're saying, who's in control of all this? If it's mostly based on cisgender heterosexual Black men telling us what to do, then it's the same oppression over and over again. The difference is that the representative is a Black man. So that's the huge difference there.
Yeah. And I think the religion is very also, it's also very relevant on the child-free conversation, because those are the people who are pro-choice, which is basically anti-abortion. Those are the people who are telling us that we're the devil because we don't want to have kids, and that we're using abortion as birth control, and you know all these things that are very much attached to religion. And I feel that judging something based on what they think is the actual religion, but like you said, they don't really know the origins of it. They don't really understand the historical implications of what that was thousands of years ago. Then it's just them trying to enforce their own values, their own personal values on other people.
Yeah, and you all are familiar with the child-free chat rooms and child-free message boards over the years. A lot of them have changed their framework, but there used to be some really big ones. Was it the Child-Free Life or something like that? I can't remember the main one, but they had to end up putting disclaimers on their first page when you log on, because they were like, this is a pro-choice and often pro-abortion space. So if you consider yourself child-free and anti-abortion, anti-forms of birth control, and you use religion, conservatism, politics as an excuse, this is not the place for you. And so there are many child-free places where people are told you cannot be child-free and believe in reproductive rights and sexual rights if you're going to come in here talking about don't use birth control, abortion's a sin, or abortion should be illegal. And so that's why I tell people, when you're talking about pro-choice, there are those of us who support people for which abortion is their first decision. And there are child-free people who are pro-choice who think abortion should be the last resort. I tell people that's the whole point of choice, though, that you should have those legal options so that you can make the decision, and not some horrible medical doctors who don't know what they're doing, or some politicians who most of them are white men in the first place, right? And so for child-free groups, one issue that's always been happening last 10 years perhaps is people thinking that to be child-free, you have to have only one viewpoint. Like we all believe the same things. And of course, we don't all believe the same things, but I think many of us believe that we want people to leave us alone, right? Like have your different opinions, but just don't come in here bashing us in the head with it. So I think that's a common sentiment. It's just that oftentimes that's placed within the context of whiteness a lot.
That is true. All right, I want to open the floor a little bit for questions. Anyone in the audience would like to ask Dr. Kimya and Dennis a question? You are welcome to open your mic and ask anything, ask away.
Hello.
Hi, Jen.
Hello. Hey, not sure if you can hear me. Yeah, I've been enjoying everything that's been said. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you. Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about the challenges of dealing with straight cis Black men? And sort of how disappointing it is when they claim to be woke, but still are on the male privilege bandwagon, I guess.
Hey, Jen. So thank you so much for that. So first, when we talk about being woke, right, we got to remember that it was African Black people who introduced the concept of woke generations ago. So whenever I see white people, including white liberals, talking about woke, that just bothers me. That's another example of cultural stealing, right? So we talk about African Black cisgender heterosexual men claiming that they are woke or awakened to injustices. We are hoping that that means that they understand the full span of injustices that includes gendered disparities and sexuality disparities. Unfortunately, most cisgender heterosexual African Black men are not conscious of that, but it's chosen lack of consciousness. And so that ties into a piece that was written, I think, a year ago, 2 years ago. I want to say it was in the Roots, one of those sources where it talked about cisgender heterosexual Black men being like white people in that sense. So what white people do to us,
I remember that piece. I
yep,
remember
you
that.
remember it. I want to say it was in the Roots, but it might not have been in the Roots. But it's something that's shared a lot across Black Twitter, especially Black Twitter for those of us who are very staunch gender equity and sexuality equity and LGBTQIA. We keep sharing that with cisgender heterosexual Black men because we have to be honest that it's a very small percentage of cisgender heterosexual Black men who believe in gender equity, who believe in equity for our people who are LGBTQIA. Unfortunately, most cisgender heterosexual Black men are that which they claim to despise. And that can pertain to religious conservatism, which includes, like I mentioned earlier, 5%er, Black Hebrew Israelites. And it includes what they consider oftentimes very traditional gender, like the purpose of our existence, which is like an African version of Adam and Eve, this falsehood. And when I say falsehood, I truly, when I meet people who believe that Adam and Eve is literal, and they believe that all these religious documents for thousands of years are literal historic interpretations rather than artistic expressions of what humans try to use to make sense of the world, there are people who literally believe that Eve was created from Adam's rib and created to keep Adam company and also created to start human reproduction. So therefore, that the male and man or the male and boy are here to rule the world and we are only there as property and when it's time to make babies and raise babies. That's a very common sentiment. So even when you're around African cultures around the world, they've adopted oftentimes a version of that sentiment, even if that was not originally part of their culture before European colonialism happened. So to get back to what Jennifer's inquiring about, I keep telling cisgender heterosexual Black men the same thing, that I refuse to collaborate if it's based on cisgender heterosexual Black men being the experts, being the authority, because that's not collaboration. That is dismantling our voices, it's dismantling our justice, and it's making everything based on not just patriarchy, but male men dominance. And it's very much also connected with violence. So when I still was a professor full time, I used to show my students, and these are predominantly African Black students and non-white Hispanic students, I used to show them this horrible video on YouTube of a conference. And the conference was presented as like an African-based conference. And the conference was based on an African Black man, cisgender heterosexual, explaining to all the conference attendees how LGBTQIA was created by white people and how gender equity was created by white people. And so this African Black man had diagrams where he was showing body parts, and it's naturally supposed to be like this because the penis in the vagina, and he really thought he was doing something really profound. And the people in the audience were all African Black people, including women, because I always tell people when we're talking about inequities and injustices, that includes the underrepresented people who go along with that, right? So there were African Black women in the audience clapping for him, applauding him. And what he was saying was 100% false. But it really is an example of how cisgender heterosexual Black men have dominated because we have been so desperate for freedom from white people and white terrorism that we oftentimes feel like if we don't comply, then we'll be abandoned, and now it's us by ourselves being terrorized by white people. And so that's centuries of the same process. It happened throughout slavery. It happened during Jim Crow. It happens now, where African Black girls, women, females, African Black LGBTQIA have very high rates of victimization from domestic violence. And it's often not reported because we're taught, especially, to always align with the men, to never get the men in trouble because the men are protecting us from white terrorism. And so it's going to keep going like that for centuries and centuries, because it is difficult to balance protection with the unity that we have for our people. And a lot of our people don't understand that pro-Blackness and Pan-Africanism has to be safety for all of us. It can't be primarily safety for cisgender heterosexual Black boys and Black men, but the rest of us are only safe if we comply. And so my main research used to be African Black boys and men and mental health and abuse by police. That was my main research. I used to do a lot of presentations on it, and I paused my research because I just had to be honest that my support for cisgender heterosexual Black men was often not reciprocated. A lot of cisgender heterosexual Black men would not defend me. Like, when white people would attack me, the cisgender heterosexual Black men would be gone, completely silent even. And I always tell people the two groups that have stalked me the most online and offline have been white people and cisgender heterosexual Black men. These are both groups that within their collective are taught that they're in charge, and any challenges to that control results in oftentimes their outrage. And so that's why the work that I do is always multitasking. I'm 100% pro-Black Pan-African, but I never hide my pride in being a woman and my pride in demanding gender equity. I never detach the two. So any space that I'm in with white people has to understand that, and any space that I'm in with my own Black people have to understand it as well.
That's great. I had another question. I wrote it down so I didn't forget. So how do you feel? I feel I'm Black. I'm also child-free. I'm an atheist. So I'm just putting that out there. And you mentioned how we kind of are brought to that conclusion of atheism when we start to really, for me, I was an atheist before I was child-free. I think I was just born an atheist, but I was definitely born in a typical African-American household where we were Baptist and went to church and all that stuff. I think there's a unique type of Black pronatalism that is often rooted in, this idea of the, African Earth Mama type of Erykah Badu type of archetype. And it's kind of hard to even combat that without coming off as anti-Black or anti-woman. It's so caught up in that. How do you feel about that? How do we deal with that narrative?
That's an awesome question. Yeah. So the difficulty of that narrative is because when you're looking at Black feminism, and then when you're looking at Alice Walker's womanism, one of my critiques of womanism is I don't dismiss it because I believe that it interlocks with everything else, but womanism is oftentimes placed within the context of Black motherhood. And so it's like the gender equity, but particularly supporting us and defending our womb. So you'll see a lot of African Black people, when they put woman, they will put WOMB in or something like that to convey that
Wow.
we're primarily walking wombs. So that's why I don't align with womanism in that sense. I align with aspects of it. So some of my former students who are African Black women, they identify as womanist. But then when we talk about dissecting how that articulates for a lot of people, womanism within the context of us having fertile wombs, and those of us who do not have wombs in our body in the first place, I always tell them, it's like, are you now saying I don't have a purpose? And so for me, that's something that, like you're saying, that's Black pronatalism is extremely complex because it's not only rooted in traditional religions, which existed before Christianity, but it's also rooted in us being told, even if not by our families, but told by Black communities in general, that we're here to not just reproduce our people, but we're here to just defend our people. And if we focus too much on our reproductive rights, then we are missing the fight for our people and the fight for our Black men's justice in particular. So that's one of the difficulties when we're talking about reproductive rights for Black females, Black girls, and Black women, because we're oftentimes told, again, like I said before, that we're being selfish. And people have the audacity to tell us in Black families and Black communities that we don't understand God's purpose for Black girls and Black women. People think that if you bring God into anything, now it's not debatable, right? So for me, I'm not a Christian, but I do follow Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And that makes a lot of African Black people angry because they don't understand a Jesus who is not connected to Christianity, which goes back to what I said before. You're not understanding the origins of Jesus, who was Jewish, that existed before Christianity was created and all that stuff, right? So this is why I tell people, when we're dismantling all of this, we're dismantling what people define as fact. They don't know the facts. They're just regurgitating literally what they've been taught all of their lives. So when college students would come to my courses, when people come to my presentations, I have to tell grown adults that you're going to learn some stuff that's different than what grandma taught you. It's different than what your family taught you, because you are still believing stuff you were taught since you were a toddler. Like, you are grown and you still believe what you were taught since 3 years old. And I have to introduce a lot of people to, like, for me, my spirituality, it's not religious, but I believe that thousands of religions and spiritualities connect. So this includes the fact that a lot of African Black agnostics and atheists, they themselves subscribe to some forms of spirituality. It's not like God and stuff like that, but it's a form of oftentimes holistic, earthly spirituality. And that's an example of how Black atheists have been able to incorporate our cultures while still saying there ain't no God. So that's the reality that I tell people to get past what your mama told you, because, you know, that's, humans are so accustomed to categorizing stuff and things don't make sense, therefore it must not exist. And I tell people, billions of realities for tens of thousands of years that you have no idea existed, they still exist even if you don't know or don't understand it.
Thank you. That makes sense. Perfect sense.
Jennifer, I mean, it makes sense. Here's the thing, as humans, we always have a tendency to want things that only exist based on our definition. And that's one thing that agnostics and atheists challenge. The one critique that I have of many agnostics and atheists, including Black agnostics and atheists, is most of them are only accustomed to European and white agnostics and atheists. So like when you go into agnostic and atheist collectives online and in person, they are very European and white based. And so that's where the difficulty comes in, is getting our people who are agnostic and atheists to not feel like they have to align with the European white version of challenging the establishment. Instead, understand that our people come from tens of thousands of years of spiritualities and faiths, including worshiping the sun and so forth. And it doesn't have to be agnostic based on anti-Christianity. It could be agnostic from a different foundation. In other words, fighting establishment means you can't subscribe to white people's version of atheism and agnosticism either. You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the you know, I can't even think of any prominent Black atheists or agnostics. It's all white men. And I've said this before, that I don't feel comfortable in that space. Another thing that's tricky about being a Black atheist is that I used to call myself pagan. And I was interested in like the earth and nature and all that stuff. And then someone was like, well, that's a religion. That's a type of religion. And I was like, okay, I don't want to be associated with any religion. It's almost like if you associate yourself with spirituality, it's been co-opted by Christianity. So you must be deep down a believer in God. It's like, no, I'm not. I believe in nature and I believe in energy and I believe in the universe, but I certainly don't believe in in God or the devil.
Yep. And I appreciate your honesty. So there are African networks online and also in person in many cities and states, and definitely on Western Hemisphere and around the world, where they unite based on that complexity, where they talk about, we understand that we have different belief systems. We talk about how paganism is the origins of Christianity. Christians just put different figures on top of it. And also talk about how earth life is worshipped among Aboriginal, Indigenous, Asian diaspora, Africans, and so forth, and not subscribing to the white version of it. So when you go to most holistic places in the United States, America, and Canada, because Canada loves to pretend that they are not the same white supremacy as America. I always tell people, when we talk about white terrorism for 529 years, that is the entire Western Hemisphere and the entire North America, okay? Adding more Black and brown people to your nation in Canada, including people who are beautifully allowed to wear turbans, does not negate the white supremacy that, because whenever white people say, well, we allow you all to wear turbans, I said, that is white terrorism. The fact that you think that you have the power to allow us to do anything. Who the hell asked you if I could wear a turban, right? That's like men say, I allow you to walk around with no bra on. No one asked you. You know what I'm saying? That's why we have to challenge the power, and that includes challenging how it's worded. When people act like they're doing us a favor, that's the whole embeddedness of the terrorism. Like, what if I showed up with a turban without you telling me I could? Right? So that's how all of this goes into it. And so like Jen was just saying, I don't know if Jen just left, when we're talking about paganism and so forth, when you go to most holistic shops, when you go to shops that sell incense, candles and so forth, when you go to shops that have witchery, it's 100% oftentimes based on white European version. And they'll have things like indigenous symbols, but it's still owned by white people. Like, we're talking about tens of thousands of years of oils, of incense, of yoga, everything that was not created by white people, not created by Europeans. But so many people in the Western Hemisphere and parts of Europe, they believe that if they go to a yoga studio, they should not see East Indians and Middle Easterners and Asian diaspora there. They expect to see white women, despite the origins of all this stuff. So the same thing happens when we're talking about paganism. People still think that this is about Europeans and about white Europeans. And this includes child-free people. Like, they claim they want this space where we're united based on being child-free, but it's really based on what white people consider to be unity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. How do you feel about the whole ADOS movement? Do you have any thoughts on that? I like the fact that your research is diasporic based, but I've found, and I didn't even know this was a thing until joining Clubhouse, but there are African Americans who insist that our struggle should be national and not international. And and my father is Jamaican, so I do have that background. And I kind of understand it from both sides, because I definitely understand the negativity that comes from Caribbean people and African people towards African Americans. But I also see the bullshit with, African Americans not understanding that, yeah, I don't even know where to begin. Like, just the differences, like, like when my stepsisters came from Jamaica, they wanted to fight them because they were from Jamaica. No other reason but they were from Jamaica, and they sound differently, they dress differently, they ate different food. So how do you feel about that?
Yes. So it's interesting you asked that, because right before I got in the podcast, I was on a 2-hour call with my friend, and we were talking about the issues with Jamaica. So I am against ADOS, because
Yay, I just put that.
I've gone at it with ADOS people on social media. They've even posted my photo and doctored up the photo, just attempts to mock me. And this is another example of when we talk about dismantling white terrorism and Pan-African pro-Blackness. Even our own people sometimes will try to terrorize us because they feel like there's only one way to do it. And if Black women in particular are not complying, we're being disobedient. So I did an interview almost 2 years ago with a colleague, and he's ADOS. And I just spoke against the male-men dominance of ADOS, and also how ADOS is oftentimes put within the context of refusing to coexist with our people elsewhere, and also complying with forms of anti-Blackness that actually supports white people. So there's a reason why some white terrorists actually are fans of ADOS, because we're talking about 5 centuries of white people creating racial categories and putting billions of people from tens of thousands of years into categories, right? It was 100% to know who to enslave and to advance white terrorism and white power. So when you talk about ADOS and any other collective that is attempting to say, we're Blacker than you are, or we're more authentic than you are, there's a reason why white people like that, because they're like, yes, go, that's exactly what we need. And I was having this conversation with my friend about Jamaica, because I've had colleagues in Jamaica who will say things like, well, that white supremacy thing, that's just you all up there. We don't have that problem in Jamaica. That's false, right? This is a problem around the world. I had a student years ago who told me in class, and he was an older student, that while my people were enslaved, they in Nigeria were scientists and in colleges. And I just had to say, tens of thousands of years, we come from a people of knowledge. White people didn't create that stuff. However, it is false to convey that we were here slaves and around the world, everyone else was free. That's false. When Europeans started having slavery, they started colonialism as well. So that includes in the continent of Africa, where libraries were taken over, right? So while we were enslaved, our people who were scientists in the continent of Africa were then forced to use white version of everything, including European wigs in courts of law. So that's also part of the ADOS. When we're talking about ADOS, we want people to understand we don't have to make it us versus them. It's okay to convey that you want reparations, particularly for descendants of transatlantic slavery, because that's what I want. I demand reparations. I don't think we should be paying taxes. But we don't have to make it an us versus them competition, because that's what white people want in the first place. White people want us to not unite and to collaborate. Want Jamaicans to feel like they are different than us. White people want South American Africans to think they're different from us, although we all got here from the same slave ships, right? White people in the continent of Africa and parts of Europe to be like, they're superior to Black people on this continent. I mean, that's the whole foundation. So that's where I tell people to learn how to multitask, learn how to articulate actions, particularly for our people who are descendants of slavery, without creating a hierarchy within our people. My brothers and I, all 4 of us, have Swahili first and middle names. So I'm Kimya Naru. Elementary school, it was the Black kids who made fun of our names. And that was back when Shaka Zulu was a show that came on. And they made fun of our names. So I tell our people, I specialized in harming each other, which complies with what white people wanted. White people wanted us to be divided, to mock each other and to harm each other, because that was the whole purpose of white people creating racial categories in the first place. So ADOS, unfortunately, that's the difference between a theory and an idea and what really happens. See, people with ADOS hashtags is just like any other hashtag. A lot of times they've created it that is very harmful and divisive.
Yeah, I didn't even know it was a thing until I joined Clubhouse. And I was like, this can't be real. I would see these rooms where it was just so negative across the board. Like, and I was like, is this real? And then I got in a conversation with someone And I was like, yeah, I don't want this to be real because this makes literally no sense. Like Marcus Garvey, Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, like we need to throw them all away because they have Caribbean backgrounds? Really? Like, I mean, this makes no sense. And anyone will tell you that Jamaica has a problem with white supremacy and colorism. That's why Rastafarians were persecuted. That's why we've never had a Miss Jamaica with locks until recently. I mean, give me a break. But anyway.
Yeah, and unfortunately, many Jamaicans do not admit the division. So I forget the name of the white man who was in charge of tourism in Jamaica who passed away this year, but many Black Jamaicans were celebrating him. And I just tell people we just need this as a reminder that despite Jamaica being predominantly Africans, it's white people in Jamaica who have dominated much of the tourism revenue and including aspects of reggae production in Jamaica. And there are some Jamaicans who deny that. And that's an example of how people oftentimes create their own reality to comfort what they've been falsely taught. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Kimmy, and thank you so much, Jennifer. Well, Kimya, it's been such a pleasure to have you here as always. It's just so great to talk to you and to learn from you. I wanted to ask you if there's something else that you would like to add to this Childfree rally before we wrap up.
Thank you so much for having me. So as you all know, these are long discussions with many topics. Like we just finished talking about Jamaica. Pronatalism is a huge problem in Jamaica. And although Jamaica is very close with African origins, we have to always remember the connections with European languages in Jamaica, how Jamaica revenue, education, medical health services are very much controlled by white people. And this is an example of the disguise that happens. A lot of times, even when European whites are not present visibly, there's still that control that's going on. And that also ties into when we're talking about pronatalism. So there are a few writings about child-free people around the world, including Choices in Jamaica. But a lot of times when you talk about being child-free in Jamaica, there are people who think you're trying to erase the African origins and force European child-free on them. So I just look forward to more of these discussions that address all people around the world of Asian descent, African descent, indigenous, and the ability to be child-free, and the ability to talk about the complexities in their nations of origin and their cultures of origin. Because it's very rare to find a place where people can actually have these discussions without feeling like you're betraying your own people. Because it's very common when we talk about issues within African cultures that our own people will say, why are you talking about this? This is supposed to be behind the scenes stuff that we don't talk about in mixed company. But I'm like, well, that's how silence happens. And that's how we keep being harmed, because you can't talk about this with your own people sometimes. And it's sometimes talking about it in open space that lets our own people know, wow, I'm not the only one struggling with this. And that's how changes happen. So I just really appreciate you all having this. And I appreciate Jennifer bringing up these complex issues. And Jennifer and I both have our hair locked up. So I just love seeing that as well.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you so much, Kimya. And thank you for everyone. Thanks everyone who's part of this Childfree rally. And if you haven't been able to be here live, then you're probably watching the replay. I would love to hear your comments if you have any questions. And I'm going also to provide them with Kimya's website, so 365 Diversity. And you can find Kimya on Twitter as well. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you. It was awesome to see you both. Thanks. And also to meet Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice meeting you too.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your Sunday.